Hello, thank you for joining me here today at Why the Book Wins, where I compare books with their movie adaptations. My name is Laura. Earlier in October, I did a book versus movie for Dracula by Bram Stoker, and I compared the book with 3 different Dracula adaptations. I watched 6 Dracula-related movies in preparation for that video, but then when it came down to comparing the plot details, I compared the book with 3 movies. And I thought I would do a part 2 follow-up to that video because a lot of people commented recommending different Dracula adaptations. And of course, Dracula just has so many adaptations, it's impossible to watch all of them. But I watched ones that were most frequently commented, so specifically the 1977 made-for-TV BBC version, which stars Louis Jordan as Dracula. It was directed by Philip Seville. A lot of people recommended that one, saying that it is the most faithful adaptation there is. And then I also got a number of people recommending the 1979 movie directed by John Badham. And that one stars Frank Langella as Dracula and Laurence Olivier as Van Helsing. So I watched that one as well, and that was from 1979. And then I also watched Blacula from 1972, directed by William Crane. So this was the 3rd Dracula movie I watched. And yeah, it's funny because all 3 of the ones I watched recently were all from the 70s. That first video I did, I had the 31 movie, the 92 movie, the 1970 movie. I watched the 2023 Renfield movie. So in my first video, I have movies throughout the decades. But for today's video, they all happen to be from the 1970s. And I will start with my spoiler-free thoughts on all of these adaptations, and then I will get into the details and how they compare with the book. But yeah, from these 3, the 77 movie, the 79 movie, and the 71 Blacula movie, I really enjoyed Dracula from 1979 and Blacula from 1971. Both of them I just found so entertaining and so engaging, and the 79 movie actually was pretty creepy and scary at times, which I had not expected. Blacula, I went into that expecting it to be very campy, which it was campy to an extent, but it also was really great social commentary, and I just loved the plot, and it kept my interest throughout, which, to be honest, after you've watched a certain amount of Dracula adaptations, it can be kind of hard to keep my interest because this is a story I've watched over and over again at this point to some extent or another. And granted, Blacula is a very different take on the story, so I think that helped me be more engaged because it was something different. And the 79 movie too also makes some differences for sure. So maybe that's one reason I liked them, was because it was different. But the 77 movie is a very faithful adaptation. So if you want to watch something that stays true to the book, then yeah, the 77 movie is the one to watch. And I did like the performances, and Louis Jordan, I thought, which he's French, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right, but I thought he was good in the role. But for the most part, this movie is 2.5 hours long. And I like the beginning at Dracula's castle with Jonathan Harker, but as this went on, I was just oh man, this is so long. It's a well done movie and it's faithful to the book. There wasn't anything specifically wrong with it aside from the fact that it kind of drags at times. And so I honestly don't know if I would ever watch the 77 movie again. I'm glad I've watched it at least once, and it is a great one to watch when talking about the book and after having recently read the book because it is very faithful. But it's not one I would highly recommend to people if they don't care how faithful the story is to the book, So yeah, the 79 movie and the 71 Blacula movie I definitely liked far better, and I was much more entertained by. And now to get into the details of the plot. So I will begin with the 79 movie, which is kind of funny. So this was the first I watched, and I did it based off my memory. I was oh, I know people have talked about the 79 movie with Frank Langella and Laurence Olivier, and I was thinking this is the movie people said was most faithful to the book. And very soon, I'm man, this one is pretty different from the book. What are people, why are people saying this is so faithful? Have they not read the book? Because this makes a lot of changes. But I was wrong, because when I went back to look at the comments, it's the 77 movie people said was faithful. So that was my fault for misremembering. But anyway, so it was kind of funny because 30 minutes into this movie, I'm just what were people talking about? And so that's when I went to go check. Anyway, this movie makes some big changes, and it wasn't actually adapted from the book specifically. This was the 31 movie. This one was adapted from a stage play of Dracula. It was adapted from a different play than the 31 movie because this was someone adapted it into a different play in the 70s. And so that's what this one is based on. And one weird change they made is they switched the names for Lucy and Mina. So Mina, she is not in very much, and she is Mina Van Helsing. She is Van Helsing's daughter. I don't think that's done in any other version. But yeah, she is the one who dies first and becomes a vampire. And then Lucy is the one that is with Jonathan Harker. She is the one that plays a bigger role throughout throughout the movie. And that's just like such a basic thing to switch the names. And it was so frustrating because even when I was typing my notes, I kept calling her Mina because she's in the Mina role. Why not just keep her name Mina? Why do you have to change the names? It's just confusing. And honestly, when I talk about this one, I'm just going to call her Mina because it helps it stay less confusing for me. So in the movie, her name was Lucy, but I'm going to call her Mina. Maybe that'll just add to the confusion. I don't know. But anyway, so yeah, Lucy dies very early on, as happens in the book. And this is another one where Dracula like incorporates himself into society. So he gets to know Lucy and Mina and Dr. Seward and Jonathan Harker, and they just know him as the neighbor who bought Carfax Abbey. And this is an interesting one too. This one is very different because we do not see Jonathan Harker. Like, he helps Dracula with the purchase, but he helps Dracula once Dracula's already here in London. So we see nothing of Transylvania, which I thought was a really interesting choice. And even though that's my favorite part of the book in a lot of ways, I thought this was a great movie. So even though they skipped that part, I didn't mind because this movie was just like so entertaining and well done that I enjoyed it nonetheless. But yeah, with Mina, she ends up like falling in love with Dracula, and it kind of reminded me of the 92 movie where, you know, he was more honest with her and she was just like fine with it because she was like, I'm into you, I don't care, I like this. And we get like this weird scene where he's like biting her and it seems like they're also like having sex, but we get like these weird graphics in the background, which I will show some images to so you can see it. But yeah, so some weird graphics going on for that scene. But also the way this movie ends, so they are tracking down Dracula and Mina is with him and they find them in a coffin on a ship. And so then like in this final battle, they get Dracula out into the sun where he like starts to burn, but then he turns into a bat and flies away. And so it seems, I read somewhere that they speculated that it was his cape flying away in the wind, but I think Dracula survived and he got away. And it's funny because Mina is like very distraught and upset, but then when she sees that he is still alive and he has gotten away, she smiles, and that's how the movie ends. So I just loved that ending. It was very unexpected. And also Van Helsing dies. And the reason they killed Van Helsing in this final, battle was because Laurence Olivier, he was just very old at this point. And they did, like, he didn't want to return for a sequel and they didn't want to risk having him return for a sequel. So they killed him off. That way they wouldn't have to worry about it. But yeah, some standout scenes, like so Lucy is buried in just a graveyard, not a mausoleum. And they dig up her grave and they find there's like a tunnel beneath her grave, and they go down there, and that is where like, vampire Lucy shows up, and she was so creepy looking, like genuinely scary. Granted, I can be easily scared sometimes, but I found her scary. And then we also have a part where Lucy, again, when she's a vampire in the book, she takes children and bites them. And in this one, it was kind of a graphic scene where she takes a child and like, it was a bit more graphic than I expected. And then also this movie, it wasn't shot in black and white. Well, like, okay, so the director wanted to shoot this in black and white as like to nod to the 31 movie, which was also, both movies are Universal. But the Universal studio was like, no, we don't want it black and white, do color. And so he did color, but he did it in like muted tones. But then when this was re-released in the 90s, whoever like cleaned up the footage, they purposefully dampened the colors even more. So the version I watched, it wasn't black and white, but it like almost could have been because the colors were so muted. So it's funny because when I read the director wanted to do it black and white, but he was told no, I thought it was funny because I was like, wow, like he found a way around that because it basically is black and white. But turns out that I guess the original one, if you saw this in theaters, it had more color than the version we watch now. But yeah, I guess that wraps it up for my 79 movie thoughts. Basically, I would highly recommend this. It is very different from the book, but I still really enjoyed it and I love the performances. Dracula doesn't even have any fangs, which Bela Lugosi doesn't either. But yeah, I really liked it. And Laurence Olivier with Van Helsing, I thought he was fine. And I like the woman who plays Mina, Lucy, but Mina. She's like a key role in all versions. And yeah, I also just loved the ending. And I never got bored, which some of these adaptations I tend to get bored watching, but that did not happen here. Meaning specifically like near like the last quarter of the book is kind of boring. And so movies that are more faithful to the book, they also tend to get kind of boring in the last quarter, but that did not happen with the 79 movie. Speaking of boring, let's move on to the 77 movie, which, sorry to people who like this, I'm not saying the movie is actually boring. I was just joking. But I will say, after a certain point, it did feel tough to get through. So this is very faithful to the book. Like I said, we have the part with Jonathan Harker at Dracula's castle, which I loved. And they do include Dracula having hairy palms, which the 92 movie also shows. And we also have a part in this movie where he gives a baby to the vampire woman. And it's not like graphic, but we see the baby and then it cuts away and then we see the vampire woman with like blood and stuff. So it was a bit more graphic than I had expected. But even though they show the baby, they do not show the woman who comes to get her baby back, which was a great scene in the book, a great scene in the 1970 movie. And the 1970 movie is the only adaptation I've seen that includes this female character. And Joseph commented on my Dracula video saying how like she was the bravest character in the whole book. And yeah, her scene is so brief, but it's just like such a powerful scene and so sad. And again, like how brave she was to go up to Dracula's castle and like be crying and begging and demanding her baby be returned to her, which obviously doesn't happen. But anyway, such a great underrated scene that only one movie has had in it. Oh, but also in the 79 movie, we see Dracula walking along the walls, which is so unsettling. We get this in the 77 movie as well, but he is described as walking like a lizard, whereas in the 77 movie, he kind of like hops, which I thought was kind of weird, and it almost took away, I don't know, it was still eerie, but I just thought the hopping was an odd choice, like not terrible, but just odd. And then we get moments where we see Dracula's face and they do this weird Photoshop filter to like make it more scary, and I get they were doing the best they could with what they had, I guess, but I didn't think it was very effective. So those scenes, and it happens many times where they have this weird filter and it just wasn't doing anything for me. But yeah, I guess ultimately I don't have much to say about this one. Like it's fine and it's a very faithful adaptation, and if that's what you're wanting, you should watch this. But ultimately, like I said, it's not one I will ever be watching again personally. And then moving on to Blacula from 1971. So the premise here is that we have Mama Walde, who is an African prince. He goes to visit Dracula in the 1700s with his wife, and he goes there to get Dracula's help to stop the slave trade. But to, big surprise to nobody, Dracula ends up being a racist and a bad person. And instead of helping Mama Walde, he instead turns him into a vampire. And not only that, he's like, you know what, I'm going to turn you into a vampire so you will have this hunger for blood, but I'm going to lock you in a coffin. And so that appetite will never be satisfied and you will just be living in misery forever because you won't die. You will just forever be in agony wanting blood that you can't have. And then his wife, he doesn't turn her, but he locks her in the same room with the coffin. And so her punishment is that she is going to like starve and die of dehydration while hearing like the screams and the cries of her vampire husband in his coffin. And so that is what happens with the start of this movie. And then centuries passed and these two American guys buy some stuff from the Dracula castle and they bring it back to America with them, including the coffin. And they end up opening the coffin, and Mama Walde, who is, Dracula calls him, like he says, I'm going to turn you into Blacula. So anyway, Mama Walde, who is a vampire, he comes out of the coffin and he kills these two guys.
And I did want to give a heads up with this movie too, that the F slur is used a number of times because the first two guys who are killed are gay. And so like the cops and people when talking about them use the F slur. So that is something to be aware of going into this movie.
And while he is like out and about in this, the 1970s America, he comes across a woman who is his wife reincarnated, which again was reminding me of the 92 movie, because that is the whole premise there, is that Mina is Dracula's wife reincarnated. And here the main female character is named Tina, which obviously seems like a nod to Mina. So at first she is scared by him because he chases her, but eventually he wins her over and she like falls in love with him and he tells her everything, like, hey, I'm a vampire. This is what happened. You are my wife. You are her reincarnated. And part of her, kind of like Mina, is like, that's crazy. But at the same time, she doesn't really think it's crazy. And she is like falling in love with him and is like down with it. And he tells her like, you're a vampire and I can make you one too and we can live forever. But I will not turn you into a vampire unless I get your consent. Of course, he turns plenty of other people into vampires without getting their consent. But Tina, he actually loves and cares about. And so he is waiting for her to give the okay. But yeah, and then the Van Helsing character in this is a doctor who, I don't know if he's a doctor who is also a cop or if he's a doctor who works with the police, because he's often talking to the police, but he's also a doctor, which Van Helsing was a doctor too. And yeah, like I said, this one does have some great social commentary, which unfortunately a lot of it still applies. This was 71. We are 50 years later, but there's a part where he's wanting to get information on one of the guys who was killed, the black guy that was killed, and he's talking to the cop about about getting this paperwork, and they find out that, the job was done sloppily and they lost the paperwork, and they're just kind of like, oh, sorry, we don't have it. And the doctor comments being like, funny how often the place gets sloppy when the victim is a black person. Whereas, the white people, they're on top of that. And then we also have a part where, Mama Walde, Blacula, he kills a cab driver, a woman cab driver. And then when the doctor, which I forget the character's actual name, but the main Van Helsing character, he goes to see her body and he's talking to this guy who works at the morgue. And he's like, what's a woman doing driving a cab? What kind of a job is that for a woman? Like, if you ask me, she was asking for trouble. So victim blaming the dead woman who was killed. And ironically enough, of course, this cab driver becomes a vampire and she, rises from the dead and kills that guy. But then Tina, even though she knows he's a vampire, and even when she finds out that he has been killing people she knows, she is still drawn to him. She's kind of in a trance though too, so she goes to be with him. And then the two of them are trying to get away. And then a cop shoots her as they are running away. And so Blacula, Mama Walde, he turns her into a vampire because it's either she turns into a vampire or she dies. And so he goes ahead and he bites her. But then this is in the final scene when the cops and people are coming after them and the coffin is closed and they think that Mama Walde is in the coffin. And so as soon as they open it, someone is there ready to push the stake in. And so they open it, push the stake in, but instead of Blacula, it is Tina who is now a vampire. And so then they end up killing Tina. And then Blacula shows up and the doctor is ready with his crucifix and his stake. But Mama Walde is like, you know what? You won't even need that, because he's so heartbroken that she has died yet again that he goes and walks into the sun so that he will also now die. And then we get this scene where his body decomposes, which was kind of similar to the 1970 movie in a way, but it's more effective in this version, I would say. But yeah, so that's how this one ends, with Tina being killed and then Blacula just voluntarily killing himself. But this one is also similar to the 31 movie and the 79 movie, where Dracula integrates himself into society because he goes out with Tina and he gets to know the doctor as a regular person and her friends and things. And there is a great scene where the doctor is, starting to suspect that it is a vampire killing these people. And he thinks Mama Walde is kind of fishy. And so he's asking him about the occult and vampires and things and getting his opinion. And so we do get this kind of a scene in multiple versions, like I said, where Van Helsing is kind of going toe to toe with Dracula. And yeah, this was just such a great scene in this movie. It's also a great scene in the 79 movie because there's a part there too where Van Helsing and Dracula are one-on-one. But yeah, like I said, I was expecting this movie to just be kind of silly and campy, and the way he looks when he is Blacula, because he can look normal, but then when he's a vampire about to bite someone, he just looks kind of weird, with all this hair and stuff. And I will say, when other people become a vampire, they also turn green, which was, very Frankenstein-esque. So it is campy to some extent, but like I said, it also can be taken as just a serious movie in my mind. I thought it was very well done. I loved the plot and I loved the performances. And again, it also was just great social commentary. And this movie I read too kind of kicked off blaxploitation horror movies, because they also did a Frankenstein movie as well as a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde kind of movie. To be honest, I haven't watched a ton of blaxploitation movies, but this one definitely made me want to watch more because I really liked it. And yeah, I guess that wraps it up for my thoughts on these 3 Dracula movies. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. And I hope I wasn't too harsh with the 77 movie, because a lot of people recommended that one. And you're right, it is very faithful to the book. But yeah, I just really enjoyed the 79 movie and the 71 Blacula movie, and I would highly recommend them. So if these are movies that you have watched, let me know your thoughts down in the comments, and go ahead and suggest even more Dracula movies. Maybe I'll even do a part 3, because I do want to watch Love at First Bite, as well as the David Niven spoof. It's either called I think it's called Vampira or something, Vampira. So I want to watch those 2 comedies, but then I'm also down to watch more serious Dracula movies. There's also another Christopher Lee one, and it's called The Taste of Dracula's Blood or something like that. And I know that one isn't faithful to the book, but I've heard it's a good Dracula movie. So I don't even care if it's faithful to the book, just a Dracula related movie. Go ahead and comment it down below. And yeah, and I will eventually maybe do a part 3 to this. So thank you so much for watching. If you have not yet seen my original Dracula video, you definitely should, so I will link to that. And yeah, thank you so much for supporting my channel, liking these videos, commenting, sharing them with others. It means so much to me. And yeah, happy Halloween. I hope you enjoyed my October content, and I will see you next time. Bye.